Whispers from Below, a horror podcast by Justin W. Geis. Scary stories, both real and fake. Hello, listeners. Welcome to Season 1, Episode 5 of Whispers from Below, a podcast by a madman for madmen. I'm your resident psychopath, Justin W. Geis, and today's topic of discussion is Rebecca Schaeffer. Now, this is a story that I believe was super public at the time. It happened in the 80s. It was one of the first cases where a stalker had become super violent and murdered someone that was sort of in the public eye. Disclaimer, this episode doesn't really have a whole lot of explicit content in it, but it is still a true crime story. This really did happen. There was a murder. He's a very sick man. She was a young budding actress, and it is kind of a sad, tragic tale. So for younger viewers, listeners rather, I would say that this is still a good introduction to true crime. It's not too dark, it's not too crazy, but I will say that this still does involve some violent topics. So listener discretion is sort of advised, more of a loosely advised sort of situation for this one. And I also want to do a disclaimer that I am terrified of stalking. It is one of my worst fears of all time. I know last week I talked about how dolls really freak me out. And I have a couple things that I'm like scared of. You know, we all have those things like I don't like bugs, I don't like clowns, I don't like dolls. But stalking is one of those things that like keeps me up at night. The idea that someone would follow you all day, every day, trying to figure out where you're going, what you're doing, and sort of create this relationship with you without you even being aware of it is really terrifying. And something that's really scary, I'll talk about a little bit later, is that it's not the people that you think that are going to stalk you. So that being said, let's jump right into the meat of this topic. So Rebecca Schaeffer was born on November 6th, 1967, and she was murdered on July 18th, 1989. She was murdered by a super big fan of hers and her stalker for 3 years, Robert John Bardo. So a little bit of backstory. We're going to get to Bardo, but let's start with Schaeffer. She was an American actress and model, and she began her career as a teen model. So when she was in high school, she grew up in Oregon. She started to do some modeling and stuff like that, just to sort of see what would happen, and it really took off. People loved her. She was in all these magazines. And originally, she comes from a Jewish family, and she wanted to be a rabbi. And then she realized she was pretty. So she went from rabbi to model. Pretty big shift, but her parents were super supportive, and they let her move to New York City to pursue this modeling career because they wanted her to be happy and successful. She then began acting, and she appeared in some television and film work, and she started to sort of get a name for herself in the industry, eventually moving to LA, I believe, unless she might have still had a residence in New York. I'm unsure, but she did live in LA when she was murdered at the time. Some of the stuff she was in was One Life to Live, Amazing Stories, My Sister Sam, Radio Day, Out of Time, Scenes from the Class Struggle in Beverly Hills, and 2 films that she was in, Voyage of Terror, The Achille Lauro Affair, and The End of Innocence, were actually released post-mortem. So after her death, they were like, hey, she already filmed her scenes, let's release it, which I think is really spooky. But you can see those and just know that you are watching a live person who is currently dead. I know that's not as weird for films. I do think it's weird that they died during the process and was still released. I think that's a little spooky and weird, but whatever. Not a producer, not my thing. But My Sister Sam was really her takeoff point. It was this TV show. I think it only ran for like a season or 2. But it was initially like a super big hit. People thought it was going to run forever. It had a huge following. People were obsessed with it, and she was the star. So she became this big name that was then going to move up. Her career was, point of all this, her career was really like picking up. She looked like she was really going to be on the up and up. She had this bright future ahead of her, and everybody could see it. They all knew she was going to be amazing and fantastic. Um, Unfortunately, then we go to Robert John Bardo and a little bit of his backstory. And he did not have the same luxuries as a child that she did. He was born on January 2nd, 1970, and he is currently serving life without parole for the murder of Schaeffer, whom he stalked for 3 years, and he is still alive. He did have an attack on him in prison. He was stabbed 11 times by a fellow inmate, and he's still going strong. So that's cool, I guess. He was what I would consider a serial stalker, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But I think a lot of this stems from this like sort of troubled childhood that he had, and he tried to seek an affection that he did not get as a kid in these people that were so successful and so loving and adoring and seemed so sweet. I think he was just creating relationships with them that didn't exist. So he was one of seven, which is just a big family. And sometimes you get lost in the mix of things, whatever. And one of his seven siblings abused him when he was a kid. He eventually got placed in foster care after he threatened to commit suicide, which I think is, I mean, I think that's really fucked up. Sorry for the language. But that's like not chill. This kid is like, I'm depressed. I'm going to end it all. And so they're like, cool, you should go to another family. Like, I feel like that's just not an acceptable response to that as someone who has suffered with depression and suicide attempts and stuff like that. Like, if my parents were just like, cool, find other parents, like, I'd be pissed. I don't think that's a good way to deal with that. Anyway, so he was moved into foster care. He ended up getting diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and he was institutionalized for his bipolar disorder and other things of that nature when he was 15, but he was only there for about a month. He dropped out of high school when he was in ninth grade and became a janitor at Jack in the Box. Shout out to Jack in the Box. And he originally stalked a woman named Samantha Smith, who was a child peace activist until her death in 1985. She died in a plane crash. And I think this is a really important thing to note about him is that he stalked someone that was always talking about child peace and was really trying to make sure that kids had great lives and led these amazing lives and did all these great things. I think that's important to note simply because he did have such a troubled childhood. I think he almost felt as though he was wronged in a way. And so to sort of cling to this woman that was like, children are great. All the kids are great. They're all great and they should all have great lives. Like, that was probably part of his psychosis originally. And when she died, he definitely had to find someone to fill that void of stalking and researching and being obsessed with because he needed something to fill that sort of obsession with. And I believe he found Schaeffer simply because she did have an amazing childhood and she was so young and her career started so young. He was probably very envious, jealous of how she achieved this at such a young age. In my opinion, I think that that's probably, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not whatever, I don't necessarily know. I'm not the most knowledgeable about the human brain, but I think I have a pretty good idea. I do think part of the reason he started to stalk her was definitely due to envy. Um, and then probably what made him snap was that the envy and the affection was not met, which is really common. If the stalker's fantasy of affection and love and obsession is not matched, a lot of times that fantasy will start to break down. And when the fantasy starts to break down, a lot of times that ends up causing an issue for them. And then that normally leads to a murder, an assault, something of that sort. So moving on to the actual day. So this is the background on both. Schaefer was a budding actress. She had this big light ahead of her, super bright future. Bardo was this mentally ill man who had a taste for stalking, and after his original fondness was sort of removed from the world, he had to find another person. So After he became obsessed with Schaeffer, he actually tried to gain access to the set of My Sister Sam where she was filming, but he got turned away. I think he went once just as a person, got turned away. And then I think he went again with a knife and they kind of like wrestled him out of the set. So Schaefer was at least protected at work, which is I think that's really important to note. But then this is where this stuff starts to get like really wild. He ended up obtaining her home address via the CDMV, and the CDMV stands for the California Department of Motor Vehicles. Now, I believe he had a private investigator that then got her information through the CDMV, but you can't do that anymore. That's not a thing that you can do. You can't get someone's address through like the DMV. Like that's not something that you are allowed to do anymore because of this case. We'll touch on that in a hot second. But just know that before a law was passed, you could find someone's address by like going to the DMV and like asking, which is horrifying to consider. So then July 18th, 1989, he confronted Schaeffer at her home and he was super angry. He was really upset with her, but he didn't show it. He was like, I'm a really big fan. I love you so much. And she kind of turned him away. She was like, this is my home. This is weird. I don't want you here. Can you please go? So he left. He went and ate breakfast at a diner where he sort of mulled over his anger. He was angry because she had appeared in a sex scene in the film, Scenes from the Class Struggle in Beverly Hills. Now, this is a film. This is not real. This is a thing that's made up. And he got really angry because he said that she, quote, lost her innocence, unquote, and became, quote, another Hollywood whore, unquote. So he was pissed because he was like, you were this lovely shining light in my life, and now you're having sex on camera for money. Like, how dare you? Blah, 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 blah. It's a job. It's a movie. She wanted to do it. She did it. I think that sort of really shapes how you view Bardo and his not only obsession with her, but his mental state at the time of the murder. He's not all there. He's not together. He sees her as this sort of object of his. She's not a person. She doesn't make her own choices. She does what he wants him to do, even though she doesn't know him at all. She has never met him. The first time she meets him is when he's at her door. So then supposedly he goes to this diner and eats a breakfast before coming back to her place and knocking on the door. And the minute she opens the door, he shoots her in the chest. I mean, that is just so tragic. I mean, it's so sad. She didn't do anything. She was doing something great for her career. She was in a film. She was on the up. And this dude was like, don't have sex on camera. Bam. That is so not fair to her. He was found the next day wandering around in like aimlessly in the street where he got arrested. And now on to the aftermath. So this case, again, like I said before, was one of the first cases that sort of sparked this topic of what makes stalking a crime, what makes stalking dangerous, what makes stalking illegal. This one's pretty straightforward. I mean, he was kind of done from the get-go, you know? He didn't really have much of a case built up for himself defense-wise. So they actually made him admit to murdering her, but trying to claim that he was psychotic. He didn't know what was going on because he wasn't present. He got diagnosed with schizophrenia by psychiatrist Park Dietz. And this again was trying to get him into that, like, I'm mentally ill. I didn't know what I was doing. Bardo also claimed that the U2 song Exit was an influence for his murder. And they played, I think this is funny. I know that this shouldn't be that funny, but they played the song in court while he lip synced the lyrics. And this was considered evidence for his defense. Now, I know where they're coming from. And I understand that they're like, oh, well, this is part of his defense because he's insane. He's not all there. He's totally crazy. But just can you imagine sitting in court on this huge case of this actress's murder? And the dude is like, yo, you two told me to kill someone. And then he just, I know that this isn't what happened, but I'm sort of picturing he did like a whole like drag race, like lip sync for your life uh dance routine to Exit by U2. I know he didn't. He just lip synced it, like probably like in his like, seat or by the defense or whatever. But I was picturing like this whole very if anyone's ever seen Chicago, the film, and when he does the razzle dazzle sequence and there's all the people around, like that's what I was picturing. But like him lip syncing Exit to U2. Anyway, moving on. This was evidence, and it was to say like he's not fully there. Like he thinks that this song told him to do this, whatever. I get it. I think it's a little weird, but he ended up being convicted of first-degree murder, and was sentenced to life without parole. And he's still doing that. As of 2019, he was still in prison and living his life despite being stabbed 11 times. He survived. He's one tough cookie, I guess. Good for him. And after all of this is where we start to get into the US government was like, this is not cool. This is really not an acceptable thing, because in court it did come up that he found out where she lived through the DMV. So the US Congress passed the Driver's Privacy Protection Act. This act reads sort of as such. This prohibits the disclosure of personal information without the express consent of the person to whom such information applies. This basically means that if you go and you ask, I need the address of said person, unless said person says, yes, I was trying to, they can have my address, you can't just get that information public. It's not public knowledge. There needs to be some form of written consent. There needs to be some form of consent from the person to ensure that you get that information, which is really important because now it has become, now it's a little bit easier because of technology, but at the time it became much less harder for stalkers to become a danger in your home. This is like a super important step in the whole stalker process, and it sort of got the ball rolling on some legislation involving stalkers and restraining orders and stuff like that. This was a case that kind of sparked a lot of that stuff. But the problem, this is where we run into an issue, is that the legal definition of stalking and the psychological definitions are so different. So you could go talk to your psychologist and be like, this dude is doing this, 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 and this. And he's like, oh, I diagnosed that person as like a stalker. You need to go talk to the police. But the legal definition is so different that he might not get any charges because he's not actually doing anything that's dangerous. Now, stalking is like defined as like any sort of contact with a person over an extended period of time that you're not like a fan of, you're not instigating, and you're telling them to leave you alone and they won't. That sort of thing becomes stalking, like constant phone calls or emails or texts or showing up at your door or showing up where you work. Like this is all stuff that's terrifying. It's all really scary, and unfortunately, the legal jargon kind of morphs how this is viewed into making it harder for men and women, but unfortunately, mostly women, to get the protection that they need until it's too late. A lot of times, the police can't really do anything until he's already have already done something that is dangerous to your health. I was recently watching a show called Stalkers Who Kill. Please check it out. It's on Netflix, or at least it was. I don't know if it still is. But it is these stories of women and men who survived stalking situations and were hurt in the process, whether that be physically, emotionally, anything like that. They're still hurt by this. And it's them talking about the stories of how this happened. And some of them are as simple as, I talked to him once when I got coffee. Others are like, we went on dates and we were lovers, but like some of them are just, I moved into a house and he didn't like it. Like it can be as simple as that. And the problem is that some stalkers you don't even know. Now, where it gets dangerous is that a lot of stalking cases, it's super common, if not like way more common than having a stranger, is actually someone that you've been partnered with, someone that you know, someone that you dated, someone that you had a one night stand with, anything like that. This obsession, I know, I know a lot of people believe that stalking comes from this deep seated anger or this deep seated mental illness. And while in cases it does, I mean, you can't deny that. I mean, Bardo was a case of, he was schizophrenic, he was bipolar, he had all sorts of mental issues that conjoined to create this sort of terrible storm to where he attacked Schaeffer. But a lot of times it's just a dude that really loves you and is like, you're mine. The problem, in my opinion, again, not a psychologist, not a, whatever. I think where stalking cases between partners, I think it's called an an intimate stalker. I think is like when you've been partnered with that person or something like that, and then they start to stalk you. So we're going to use that term, an intimate stalker. In the cases of that, I think where it gets dangerous is when they view you as an object and not a human being. Um, I have had people like that in my life. I wouldn't say it was like full on stalking, but I did have an ex that was super duper crazy. And like, I didn't realize how bad it was till I like looked back on it and was like, oh, I should have talked to someone about that. Like he was like, you can't escape. I'm going to find you. He never really did. Um, but that sort of thing, like at the time I was like, well, what am I going to do? I can't do anything about this. He's just, I can't do anything about it. It's just a threat. And that's the problem with cases like this is nobody, you can't, in the case of Schaefer, she didn't even know that she had someone that was like obsessed with her. She didn't really know. So that's dangerous. But the problem is if you know about it and you feel like you can't do anything about it, this is a problem. So now there's all sorts of things like you can get a restraining order. That's great. But what is that piece of paper going to do when he's standing at your door with a gun? I mean, that's something to really think about. And this is why I think that this is such a scary thing. Because, like, I'm a firm believer in ghosts. I don't find ghosts that scary because I grew up with them. I don't think they're scary. Um, Kidnapping is another one of my big fears. I'm planning on doing an episode like that in the future about some like really wild kidnapping cases where they were like trapped for like 20 years and stuff like that. Um, but stalking is one of those things that somebody could be doing it right now and I would have no idea. Someone could be following me home every day. I take the same train every day. I live in the same apartment. I pretty much leave at the same times of day to go to auditions and stuff. I'm always at Pearl. I'm always at Ripley. You know, it it is scary to know that I'm a person of routine. I like having routine. It's scary to think that that routine could be something that becomes a downfall in the future. And that's the thing too to think about and be careful of is that stalking doesn't just happen to famous people. There are really big cases of it happening to famous people. I think it was it Jennifer Lopez or I think it was Jennifer Lopez who had that stalker that like lived in her summer home for like a short amount of time. I know that um, a couple other celebrities have come out with these cases where like they came face to face with their stalker in their home and it was really dangerous for them. Um, and I think Sandra Bullock is one of them. I think she like saw him in her home and like called 911, like the whole nine yards. But it doesn't just happen to famous people. A lot of stalking cases happen to people that are like normal and like live these ordinary lives and are really plain. It just depends on your situation and where you end up. So just be careful. I'm not saying be paranoid. Like I live that life. I am so paranoid. I think everyone's around all the time. Like my brain last night, uh, my boyfriend was laughing at me because we were laying in bed and whatever. We were cuddling and it was being, super cute, whatever. And we heard this thunk and it was like from our upstairs neighbor. Like I live in an apartment building, duh. But I went fully tense and my brain immediately was like, someone's in the apartment and they're here for me. But like, why? Why was that like the instant? And I did all the research, you know, a couple days prior. Like it's not like I had done the research that day and then had that at night. Like this is just something that my brain does. It's like, well, you're being stalked and you're going to die. So have fun with that. Um, that being said, stalker cases are really, I think they're really important to learn about. I think they're really cool. Cool in the sense of like, it's cool to know that you can survive. It's not hopeless for you. Like you can get out of that alive. Um, I think that it's something that needs to be worked on more from the legislative aspect. I think that we're not quite there yet with defining what stalking is and how to protect people who are victims of stalking. And it really messes you up. Like this one woman, it was on Stalkers Who Kill. Go check it out. It's super cool. This one woman's like fully in a wheelchair, has no feeling from the waist down because he shot her like a bunch of times. She's still alive, but now she's like in a wheelchair because this dude went crazy. There was another case of this dude that like shot up where she worked. He went in and did like a full like active shooter moment because she like wasn't dating him anymore. So that's cool. I think it's really important to be careful with who you are intimate with. I think it's really important to be mindful of your surroundings. And if you feel like someone's been following you, report it. It can't hurt. It really can't to get a paper trail going of the fact that you've talked about this. It can help you in the future. It's really important to just be vocal because I know as someone who has dealt with something similar to this, not this extreme. He did not attack me, but I did like he drove by my place of work once or twice. And it's this sort of like intimidating thing to try to get you riled up. And I think it's important that people realize that it's okay to talk about. You can talk about it. You can go to the police. There is stuff you can do about it. They're not going to get away with it. You can survive it and you can move past it. Um, so, yeah, that sort of wraps everything up for this episode. This is another shorter episode. So, again, since the podcast is so new, let me know. Do we like these 30-minute episodes? Do we like the longer episodes? Do we want some episodes that are even longer? Would you guys like to hear me talk for an hour? I don't understand why you would, but if you want me to talk for an hour, let me know. I can totally do that. I'm thinking of starting to do some two-parter episodes. Let me know if that would be something cool that you guys would be into. And for the two-parter episodes, it might be I release episode 1 on a Monday, and then like that Thursday or Friday, I release part 2. Or I wait a whole week. Let me know if you'd want like the two-parters a little bit closer together. I wouldn't mind doing that. But yeah, we're about halfway through season 1. How exciting. So we have like 5 more episodes left for season 1, and then I'm going to take a break. You guys can reach out to me via the Instagram or the email. They are both whispers from below, no spaces, no underscores, no capitals. Please reach out. Let me know what you're thinking of the podcast. Please share it. I'm on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher. I post this all on YouTube. It's the same handle that it is on every other platform. I post this all to YouTube if that's the sort of thing you like to listen to. I'm on iHeartRadio. This podcast is everywhere. You have no excuse not to tell your friends to listen to it. So thank you guys so much for listening. And remember, stalkers are horrifying. Rebecca Schaeffer was really on the up and up. And you should look over your shoulder more frequently than you think you should. Like, really.